The winter wind howled through the streets of Manhattan, biting through even the thickest coats. Sophia Carter, a young millionaire and heir to the Carter financial empire, walked briskly down the sidewalk, her tailored coat doing little to shield her from the cold or the weight of her thoughts. Her father's ultimatum echoed in her mind like a hammer striking an anvil. Marry Lucas Harrington, or lose your place in the company. Sophia clenched her fists in her pockets, her breath visible in the icy air. The idea of marrying Lucas, the son of her father's business partner, made her stomach churn. It wasn't just that she didn't love him, she couldn't stand him. Lucas was arrogant, manipulative, and everything Sophia despised about the world she was born into. But her father, Margaret Carter, was relentless. To her, this marriage wasn't about love. It was about power, alliances, and securing the family's legacy. As she turned onto a quieter street, her polished boots crunching over patches of frost, Sophia's gaze fell on a figure huddled on a park bench. A man, wrapped in a tattered blanket, sat with his head bowed, his dark hair peeking out from under a knit cap. His presence was a stark contrast to the polished, calculated world Sophia inhabited. She hesitated, unsure why she didn't just keep walking. But something about him, his stillness, his quiet defiance against the cold, drew her in. Little did she know this chance encounter with Ethan Blake, a man who had lost everything, would change both of their lives forever. And in her desperation to escape her father's control, Sophia would make a decision that would set them both on a path neither could have predicted. The park was eerily quiet, the skeletal trees casting long shadows under the dim glow of the streetlights. Sophia hesitated as she approached the bench, her heels clicking softly against the frozen pavement. The man didn't look up, his shoulders hunched against the cold, his hands clutching the edges of the tattered blanket wrapped around him. For a moment, she considered walking away. What was she even doing here? But something about him, his stillness, his quiet defiance kept her rooted in place. "Are you just going to stand there?" His voice broke the silence, low and steady, but with an edge of sharpness. He didn't look at her, but his words carried a weight that made her flinch. "Or are you one of those do-gooders with a spare coffee and a lecture about life choices?" Sophia blinked, caught off guard by his bluntness. "Neither," she replied, her tone sharper than she intended. "I was just passing by." The man finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. They were piercing, far more alert than she expected, and filled with something she couldn't quite place. Defiance, maybe? Or exhaustion? "Well, congratulations," he said dryly, adjusting the blanket around his shoulders. "You've passed." Sophia crossed her arms, her breath visible in the cold air. "Do you always greet strangers like this?" "Only the ones staring at me like I'm some kind of exhibit," he shot back, his tone cutting. But then, as if realizing he might have been too harsh, his gaze softened slightly. "Nice coat," he added, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Let me guess, Wall Street?" "Something like that," Sophia replied, a faint smirk tugging at her lips despite herself. There was something about his sharpness, his refusal to be pitied, that intrigued her. It was a stark contrast to the polished, insincere conversations she was used to. The man shifted slightly, his blanket slipping to reveal a frayed jacket underneath. "So, what's your deal?" he asked, his tone still guarded. "You don't exactly scream Good Samaritan." Sophia hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Let's just say I needed some air," she said finally, her voice quieter now. He studied her for a moment, his dark eyes narrowing. "Air is free," he said, leaning back against the bench. "For now, anyway." Sophia couldn't help but laugh softly at his remark, though the sound felt foreign to her. She hadn't really laughed in weeks. "What's your name?" she asked, taking a step closer. "Eton," he replied, his tone cautious. "And you?" "Sophia," she said, offering a small nod. "Do you always sleep here?" "Do you always interrogate strangers in parks?" he countered, folding his arms across his chest. Despite the biting cold, there was a faint smirk on his lips, as if he found her persistence amusing. Sophia ignored his question, her gaze lingering on the worn edges of his blanket. "You shouldn't have to be here," she said softly, surprising even herself with the bluntness of her words. Ethan's laughter was low and bitter. "And what would you know about shouldn't, Miss Wall Street?" he asked, his voice cutting. "People like me don't end up here because we choose to." His words stung, and Sophia realized she didn't have a good answer. Instead, she asked, "How long?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "How long what?" "How long have you been on the streets?" she clarified, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan leaned back, his breath visible in the cold air. "Long enough," he said simply, avoiding her gaze. "But I get by." There was a quiet pride in his voice that caught Sophie off guard. Here was someone who had lost everything, or nearly everything, and yet hadn't crumbled. In contrast, her world was defined by abundance, yet she felt more trapped than ever. "I'm sorry," she said softly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Don't pity me," Ethan snapped, his eyes flashing. "Save it. People like you only show up to feel better about yourselves." "I wasn't," Sophia began but stopped herself. Maybe he wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe she had stopped because his presence made her own problems seem trivial by comparison. But there was something more. He intrigued her. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. Ethan shifted, adjusting his blanket again. "Look," he said finally, his tone softer now. "If you're going to stand here and chat, at least make yourself useful. There's a coffee shop down the block, black, no sugar." A startled laugh escaped Sophia. "Bossy, aren't you?" "Efficient," Ethan corrected, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Go on, Miss Wall Street." For reasons she couldn't fully understand, Sophia turned and walked toward the coffee shop he'd pointed out. The brisk air cleared her mind slightly, but the knot in her chest remained. When she returned, coffee in hand, Ethan took it without a word. "Thanks," he said grudgingly, after a long pause. Then, glancing at her, he added, "So, what's your deal? You don't exactly scream Good Samaritan." Sophia sat down on the far end of the bench, the cold wood biting through her coat. "Let's just say I needed some perspective," she said quietly. Ethan studied her over the rim of the cup. "And did you find it?" She looked out at the barren trees and the distant lights of the city. "I think I might have," she replied softly. They sat there in silence, two strangers sharing the weight of their separate worlds. And for the first time in a long while, Sophia felt like she wasn't entirely alone. The gray morning light seeped through the skeletal branches of the park's trees, casting a cold glow over the bench where Ethan sat. He hadn't slept. His mind churned with thoughts of the strange woman who had appeared out of nowhere the night before, offering him something that sounded more like a joke than a serious proposal. A marriage? To her? It was absurd. And yet the way she had spoken, calm, determined, and desperate, lingered in his mind. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, the coffee cup from the night before still clutched in his hands. He had spent years surviving on the streets, learning to trust no one and expect nothing. People like Sophia Carter didn't just walk into his life. They didn't offer deals, and they certainly didn't stick around. But she had. And now, her words echoed in his head. "You have nothing to lose." But that wasn't true, was it? Ethan had lost everything once, before his family, his career, his dignity. He had trusted someone, and it had cost him everything. The idea of stepping into her world, even temporarily, felt like walking into a trap. Yet, as he sat there, the cold biting at his skin, he couldn't help but wonder. What if she was right? What if this was his chance to start over? Across the city, Sophia sat in her penthouse, staring out at the sprawling skyline. The warmth of the room did little to ease the chill in her chest. She had spent the night replaying her conversation with Ethan, questioning whether she had made a mistake. What if he said no? What if he agreed but it all fell apart? Her father, Margaret Carter, and Lucas Harrington wouldn't just let her walk away from their plans. They would dig, they would pry, and they would find a way to destroy her. Sophia's fingers tightened around the edge of her coffee cup. She had spent her entire life following the rules, doing what was expected of her. But this time, she couldn't. She wouldn't. The thought of marrying Lucas, of becoming a pawn in her father's endless power plays, made her stomach churn. Ethan was her only way out. He was unpredictable, yes, but he was also honest in a way no one else in her life was. And that honesty was what she needed. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, her heart sinking as her father's name flashed across it. She let it ring, unwilling to face him just yet. Instead, she stood and grabbed her coat. She needed to know if Ethan had made a decision. Ethan was still sitting on the bench when Sophia found him. The sight of her approaching, her coat pulled tightly around her, made him sit up straighter. She looked different in the daylight, less polished, more vulnerable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Did you think about it?" Sophia asked finally, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. Ethan studied her, his dark eyes unreadable. "You're serious about this," he said, more a statement than a question. "I am," Sophia replied, meeting his gaze. "I need a way out, and you need a chance to start over. It's not perfect, but it's something." Ethan leaned back, his arms crossed. "And what happens when your family finds out? When they dig into my past and realize I'm not the kind of person they want in their world?" "They won't," Sophia said firmly. "They'll see what I want them to see, and once my father backs off, we can go our separate ways. No strings attached." Ethan's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He didn't trust her, not completely. But there was something in her voice, in the way she looked at him, that made him believe she wasn't lying. She was desperate, yes, but she was also sincere. "What's in it for me?" he asked, his tone cautious. "A place to live," Sophia said. "Financial stability, a chance to get back on your feet. And when it's over, you'll be free to do whatever you want." Ethan hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of the bench. He had spent years surviving on his own, refusing to rely on anyone. But this was different. This wasn't charity. It was a deal. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like he had a choice. "All right," he said finally, his voice low. "I'll do it. But on one condition." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "No lies," Ethan said, his gaze steady. "If we're going to do this, I need to know I can trust you." Sophia nodded, relief washing over her. "No lies," she agreed. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. And as they sat there, the weight of their decision settling between them, both of them knew there was no turning back. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the sprawling penthouse that Sophia called home. Ethan stepped inside hesitantly, his worn boots scuffing against the polished marble floors. The space was immaculate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the Manhattan skyline, and every piece of furniture looked like it had been plucked straight from a designer catalog. It was a world so far removed from his own that it felt almost surreal. Sophia walked ahead of him, her heels clicking against the floor as she shrugged off her coat and draped it over a chair. "This is where you'll be staying," she said, her voice calm but businesslike. "There's a guest room down the hall. You can make yourself comfortable?" Ethan stood frozen, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. "Comfortable?" he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. "Right." Sophia turned to face him, her expression softening slightly. "I know it's a lot," she admitted. "But if we're going to make this work, you'll need to get used to it. My family will expect you to fit in." Ethan let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Fit in? Look at me, Sophia. I don't belong here." "You don't have to belong," she said firmly. "You just have to play the part." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He had agreed to this after all. Still, the weight of what he had signed up for was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about pretending to be her husband. It was about stepping into a world that had no place for someone like him. The first test came sooner than either of them expected. That evening, Sophia's mother, Margaret Carter, called to inform her that the family was hosting a dinner party the following night. "Bring your fiancé," Margaret had said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "We'd all love to meet him." Sophia hung up the phone with a sigh, her fingers pinching the bridge of her nose. "Well," she said, glancing at Ethan, who was sitting on the couch flipping through a magazine he clearly had no interest in. "Looks like you're meeting my family tomorrow." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Your family? As in the people who are going to see right through this?" "They won't," Sophia said quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. "They'll be too busy trying to impress each other to notice anything." Ethan leaned back, crossing his arms. "And what exactly am I supposed to say to these people?" "Hi, I'm Ethan, your daughter's totally legitimate fiancé who just happens to have no background, no connections, and no clue what I'm doing here." Sophia sighed, sitting down across from him. "We'll go over everything," she said. "Your backstory, how we met, all of it. They won't ask too many questions as long as you act confident." Ethan smirked. "Confidence. Right, that's all it takes." Sophia ignored his sarcasm, pulling out her laptop and opening a document. "Let's start with the basics," she said. "Your name is Ethan Blake. You're a freelance photographer who travels a lot, which is why they haven't met you until now. We met at a gallery opening 6 months ago, and we've been inseparable ever since." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "A photographer? Really?" "It's believable," Sophia said, typing quickly. "And it explains why you don't have a traditional job." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "And what happens when they start asking about my work, or my family, or anything else I can't fake?" Sophia hesitated, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. "We'll keep it simple," she said finally. "The less you say, the better." Ethan didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "Fine. But if this blows up in our faces, don't say I didn't warn you." The next evening, Ethan found himself standing in front of a mirror, adjusting the tie that Sophia had insisted he wear. The suit she had bought for him fit perfectly, but it felt like a costume, like he was playing a role in someone else's life. He glanced at Sophia, who was standing nearby in a sleek black dress, her hair swept up in an elegant bun. She looked every bit the part of a wealthy socialite, but there was a tension in her eyes that betrayed her nerves. "You ready?" she asked, her voice steady but quiet. Ethan let out a breath, straightening his tie one last time. "As ready as I'll ever be." The dinner party was held at the Carter family estate, a sprawling mansion that made Sophia's penthouse look modest by comparison. The moment they walked through the grand double doors, Ethan felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on him. Margaret Carter was the first to approach, her sharp gaze sweeping over him like a predator sizing up its prey. "So what?" she said, her voice cool and measured. "This is the man who's stolen my daughter's heart." Ethan forced a smile, extending his hand. "Ethan Blake, it's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Carter." Margaret shook his hand, her grip firm. "The pleasure is mine," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Sophia's told us so much about you." "Has she?" Ethan replied, glancing at Sophia, who gave him a tight smile. The rest of the evening was a blur of forced smiles, polite small talk, and subtle interrogations. Lucas Harrington, the man Sophia was supposed to marry, made a point of cornering Ethan near the bar. "So," Lucas said, swirling his glass of whiskey, "what's your story, Blake? How does a guy like you end up with someone like Sophia?" Ethan met his gaze evenly, refusing to be intimidated. "I guess I just got lucky," he said, his tone calm but firm. Lucas smirked, his eyes narrowing. "Lucky," he repeated. By the time the evening ended, Ethan felt like he had run a marathon. As they climbed into the car to head back to the penthouse, he let out a long breath. "Well," he said, glancing at Sophia, "that was fun." Sophia gave him a tired smile. "You did fine," she said. "Better than I expected." Ethan leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. Let's just hope your family thinks so too. The days following the dinner party were a whirlwind of carefully orchestrated appearances and rehearsed conversations. Ethan had managed to hold his own, but the tension between him and Sophia's family was palpable. Margaret Carter, in particular, seemed determined to uncover the cracks in their story. And then there was Lucas Harrington, whose smug smirks and probing questions made it clear he wasn't buying their act. Ethan had expected this. What he hadn't expected was how exhausting it would be to keep up the charade. Every interaction felt like a test, every glance a potential threat. And yet, through it all, Sophia remained calm and composed, her determination unwavering. It was her strength that kept him going, even as doubts began to creep in. One evening, as Ethan sat in the penthouse's living room, flipping through a book he wasn't really reading, Sophia walked in, her phone pressed to her ear. Her expression was tense, her voice clipped as she spoke. "I don't care what he said, Margaret," she snapped. "This is my life, not yours." Ethan glanced up, watching as she paced back and forth, her heels clicking against the floor. "No, I'm not going to explain myself to Lucas," she continued. "He has no right to—" She stopped abruptly, her eyes meeting Ethan's. "I have to go," she said into the phone before hanging up. "Trouble in paradise?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. Sophia sighed, sinking into the chair across from him. "My mother," she said, rubbing her temples. "She's convinced this is all some elaborate scheme to embarrass her." Ethan smirked. "Well, she's not entirely wrong." Sophia shot him a look, but there was no real anger behind it. "Lucas has been asking questions," she said after a moment. "Digging into your past." Ethan's smirk faded. And so far he hasn't found anything," Sophia said. "But it's only a matter of time." Ethan leaned back, his jaw tightening. He had known this would happen eventually. People like Lucas Harrington didn't let things go. But the thought of his past being dragged into the open made his stomach churn. There were things he hadn't told Sophia, things he wasn't sure he could tell her. "What happens if he does find something?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Sophia hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "We'll deal with it," she said finally. Ethan wanted to believe her, but the weight of his secrets pressed heavily on his chest. He had spent years burying the past, trying to forget the life he had lost, but now, it seemed, the past was determined to catch up with him. The next day, Ethan's fears were realized. He was walking back to the penthouse after a rare moment of solitude when he noticed a man leaning against the building's entrance. The man was tall and sharply dressed, his dark hair slicked back. Ethan recognized him immediately. Daniel Harrington, Lucas's older brother. "Ethan Blake," Daniel said, his voice smooth and calculated. "We need to talk." Ethan stopped, his hands clenching into fists. "I don't have anything to say to you." "Oh, I think you do," Daniel replied, a smirk playing on his lips. "You see, I've been doing a little digging, and what I found was interesting." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," Daniel said, stepping closer. "You think you can just waltz into our world and no one will notice? You're a fraud, Blake. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. Daniel's words had struck a nerve, and he knew there was no point in denying it. "Tell me," Daniel continued, his tone mocking, "how does it feel to go from being the son of a successful businessman to, this?" He gestured vaguely at Ethan, his smirk widening. "Must be quite the fall from grace." Ethan's blood ran cold. He hadn't told anyone about his past, not even Sophia. But somehow, Daniel had found out. "Stay out of my business," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "Your business?" Daniel laughed. "You don't have any business, Blake. You're nothing. And when I'm done with you, Sophia will see that too." Ethan didn't wait for him to say anything else. He turned and walked away, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. But Daniel's words followed him, echoing in his mind like a taunt he couldn't escape. When Ethan returned to the penthouse, Sophia was waiting for him. She took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. He had spent so long keeping his past buried, but now it seemed there was no avoiding it. "Daniel Harrington," he said finally. "He knows." Sophia's eyes widened. "Knows what?" Ethan took a deep breath, his hands trembling. "About my family. About what happened to me." Sophia stepped closer, her expression softening. "Ethan, whatever it is, you can tell me." For a moment he considered lying, but then he remembered the promise they had made to each other. No lies. "My father was a businessman," he said quietly. "He built a company from the ground up, but he trusted the wrong people. Lucas and Daniel's father, he destroyed us, took everything. My father couldn't handle it. He took his own life." Sophia's breath caught, her hand covering her mouth. "Ethan, I'm so sorry." Ethan shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I don't need your pity," he said, his voice hard. "I just thought you should know what you're dealing with." Sophia reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not alone in this," she said firmly. "We'll figure it out." For the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face this alone. The tension in the air was palpable as Sophia and Ethan sat across from each other in the penthouse's living room. The revelation of Ethan's past had shifted something between them. For the first time, Sophia saw the cracks in his armor, the pain he carried, the weight of his losses. And for the first time, Ethan saw that Sophia wasn't just a privileged heiress trying to escape her problems. "We can't let them win," Sophia said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "Daniel and Lucas, they think they can manipulate everyone around them, but we're not going to let that happen." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "And how exactly do you plan to stop them? They've got money, power, and connections. What do we have?" Sophia's lips curved into a small, defiant smile. "The truth." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "The truth? You think that's enough?" "It has to be," Sophia replied. "Your father's company, what happened to your family, it's all connected to theirs. If we can prove what they did, we can take them down." Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. He had spent years trying to forget the past, to bury the pain and move on. But now, faced with the chance to expose the people who had destroyed his life, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. "What do you need me to do?" he asked finally. Sophia's smile widened. "We're going to gather evidence. And then, we're going to make sure the whole world knows who the Harringtons really are." The plan came together quickly. Sophia used her connections to dig into the Harrington family's business dealings, while Ethan reached out to people from his past, former employees of his father's company who had witnessed the Harringtons' betrayal firsthand. It wasn't easy. Many of them were reluctant to talk, afraid of the power the Harringtons still wielded. But slowly, piece by piece, the puzzle began to take shape. One night, as they sat in the penthouse surrounded by stacks of documents and notes, Ethan glanced at Sophia. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice quiet. "This isn't just about me, is it?" Sophia looked up from her laptop, her expression thoughtful. "It's about both of us," she said. "You lost everything because of them, and I've spent my whole life being controlled by people like them. This is my chance to take back my life. And it's your chance to get justice." Ethan nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. Sophia smiled. "We're in this together." The final confrontation came sooner than they expected. Margaret Carter, sensing that something was amiss, had called for a family meeting at the Carter estate. Sophia and Ethan arrived together, their expressions calm but resolute. The Harringtons were already there, Lucas with his smug smirk, and Daniel, who looked as though he was already planning his next move. Margaret greeted them with her usual icy demeanor. "Sophia," she said, her gaze flicking to Ethan. "And Ethan, how lovely of you to join us." Sophia didn't waste any time. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm. "All of us." Lucas raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "This should be good." Sophia ignored him, pulling a folder from her bag and placing it on the table. "This is everything we found," she said, her gaze sweeping over the room. "Proof of the Harringtons' involvement in the collapse of Blake Industries, the fraudulent deals, the backroom negotiations. It's all here." The room fell silent. Margaret's expression hardened, while Daniel's smirk faltered. Lucas, however, leaned back in his chair, his confidence unshaken. "And what exactly do you plan to do with this?" he asked, his tone mocking. "Go to the press? Take us to court? You think anyone will believe you?" Sophia met his gaze, her eyes blazing with determination. "Yes," she said simply. "Because we have witnesses, people who worked for Blake Industries, people who saw what your family did, and they're ready to talk." Lucas's smirk disappeared, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Daniel, however, leaned forward, his expression cold. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Ethan, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm not afraid of you anymore." The room erupted into chaos. Margaret tried to regain control, while Lucas and Daniel hurled threats and accusations, but Sophia and Ethan stood their ground, refusing to back down. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear that the Harringtons' grip on power was beginning to slip. The fallout was swift. Within days, the story broke in the media, exposing the Harringtons' corruption and their role in the collapse of Blake Industries. The public backlash was immediate, and the Harrington family's reputation was left in tatters. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of closure. The people who had destroyed his life were finally being held accountable. As for Sophia, she had finally broken free from her family's control. Margaret, though furious, could no longer dictate her life, and Lucas Harrington, the man she had been forced to consider marrying, was nothing more than a distant memory. The sun was setting over Manhattan, casting a warm golden glow across the skyline. Ethan stood on the balcony of Sophia's penthouse, his hands resting on the railing as he looked out at the city below. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. The weight he had carried for so long, the anger, the grief, the shame, was finally beginning to lift. The Harringtons had been exposed, their empire shaken, and the truth about his father's downfall was finally out in the open. Behind him, Sophia stepped onto the balcony, a soft smile on her face. She was holding 2 glasses of wine, one of which she handed to him. "You look like you're a million miles away," she said, leaning against the railing beside him. Ethan took the glass, his fingers brushing against hers for a brief moment. "Just thinking," he said, "about how much has changed." Sophia nodded, her gaze drifting out over the city. "It's strange, isn't it? How everything can feel so different, and yet the world keeps moving like nothing happened." Ethan glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're different," he said. "You're not the same person I met on that park bench." Sophia laughed softly, shaking her head. "Neither are you." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the city humming faintly in the background. Finally, Sophia turned to face him, her expression serious. "So, what now?" she asked. "What happens next?" Ethan hesitated, the question hanging in the air between them. For so long he had been focused on survival, on simply getting through each day, but now, for the first time, he had the chance to think about the future. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think I want to start over, build something new." Sophia smiled, her eyes soft. "You deserve that," she said. "You deserve a fresh start." Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady. "So do you." Sophia's smile widened, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, the unspoken connection between them stronger than ever. They had started this journey as strangers, bound together by desperation and circumstance, but now they were something more. Partners, allies, maybe even something deeper. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began to rebuild his life. With Sophia's help, he found a small apartment of his own and started working with a nonprofit organization that helped people experiencing homelessness. It wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was making a difference. Sophia, meanwhile, took control of her own destiny. She stepped away from her family's business, using her resources to start a foundation dedicated to helping those in need. It was her way of breaking free from the expectations that had defined her life for so long. They stayed in touch, meeting for coffee or dinner whenever their schedules allowed. Their relationship was no longer defined by contracts or obligations, but by mutual respect and understanding. They had both been through so much, and while their paths were no longer intertwined in the same way, they knew they would always be there for each other. One evening, as they sat together in a small cafe, Sophia looked at Ethan and smiled. "You know," she said, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad I met you." Ethan chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Even if it started with a fake marriage proposal?" Sophia laughed, shaking her head. "Especially because of that." Ethan raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To strange beginnings," he said. Sophia clinked her cup against his, her smile warm. "And even stranger endings." As they sat there, the noise of the cafe fading into the background, they both knew that their story wasn't really over. It had simply changed, and for the first time in a long time, they were both ready to face whatever came next. Thank you so much for watching this story on Emma's Stories. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more inspiring, emotional, and thought-provoking stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue sharing these incredible tales. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Sophia and Ethan's situation? We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, this is Emma's Stories, where every story has a heart. See you in the next video.